Hi everyone. I decided to create this series called Law Inspired Coaching because I think we live in a world with a lot of arguments and misunderstandings that cause those arguments. One of the reasons I decided to do law is for dispute resolution, and that's not just in the professional sense, but in the very personal sense of solving problems that people face. We dislike another person and brand them our enemy because we face a disagreement. This disagreement sometimes is simply the result of not seeing the other person's point of view. We assume that the disagreement means they dislike us or have some agenda against us. But if only we were to step back and look at it as a clash of two points rather than two human beings, we might actually find a solution out. I first need to dispel the myth that convincing someone is about putting forth your idea, that you have to put your idea forward and push the other person away. If you take that stance, it's natural that they get defensive and want to push against you. And you think this is a situation of them disliking you and you brand them an enemy for life and they might do the same to you. But why not take an alternative route, one that Dale Carnegie himself did? That name might be familiar to some. He wrote many famous self help books, one of them in particular being How to Enjoy Your Life and Your Job. One of the challenges he recounted in this book was something that I think is useful to talk about today. The hotel manager charged him an increase in rent for the venue that he was going to host his lectures by 300% of the original price. This was difficult for him, not just because of the increase in cost, but because he had already announced the venue to his attendees and sold the tickets. Thus, changing the venue was near impossible, and the cost of redoing the publicity might have been high as well, not to mention the inconvenience posed to attendees. What if these attendees turned out at the wrong places? Turned out at the original place and turns out the lecture was somewhere else. It's normal for someone in Carnegie's position to panic and start accusing the hotel of breaking their original agreement. But he took a different way out. He expressly acknowledged the manager's need to protect the interests of the hotel. He recognized that the manager was an employee of the hotel and was contractually bound to serve the interests of that hotel, not that the manager was trying to have some agenda against him. This was a very important first step, as I'll soon explain why. He then, only after doing that, he pointed out some of the disadvantages to him not giving his seminars at the hotel. He pointed out the loss of current rental income from not having him deliver his workshop for those 2 or so weeks. And this was a disadvantage to the manager, obviously, because there was some income loss. However, Dale Carnegie also recognized explicitly to the manager that this might be a minor loss. The manager, from not renting it out for those two or so weeks, might be able to rent out the room to someone who can bring in even more audiences, to someone who is willing to pay the higher rent. Carnegie was humble enough to recognize that, and I think that really helped in his negotiation. But after that, he kept his strong card as well, which further pushed his negotiation strength. He pointed out the loss of publicity to the hotel from educated and cultural people who would have visited his seminar. This was something that didn't have a rebuttal, at least not so in Carnegie's eyes. The outcome was an increase in rent by 50% only. Compare this to the initial proposal by the manager that was about 300%. This time it was only about 50. And there are some lessons we can learn from this. Carnegie recognized that the manager had to act in the interest of the company to make profit for the company, regardless of the manager's own belief. This is very important when we disagree with someone working as an employee. We might disagree with the company policy and we might feel the employee is defensive and rude to us. But it's important that we do not jump to that conclusion because we need to recognize that the employee is duty bound. In reality, they might actually agree that we are right. They are bound to the interests of the company. Recognizing that the manager himself was in a hard position allowed the manager to see Carnegie as not an enemy and serve as his ally in negotiating with the managers higher up to reduce the rent increment to 50%. That was what happened. That was how they achieved the outcome of only 50%. The manager went to talk to the person higher up who had the power to reduce the rent increment. The second thing that Carnegie did was knowing the value of his own services. In his second disadvantage to the manager, he confidently claimed that his seminars will be attended by educated and cultured people. Though you are negotiating and though you are willing to recognize the interest of the other side, it is important not to forget your own value as well. Most people often are on the extreme of either this point or the first point. They either hold their value too high and not be willing to negotiate, or they hold their value too low and then feel the world is against them when they lose the negotiation. Carnegie was able to give an example of how he did both. There were more lessons as well. Carnegie did not take it personally, although he was wrong. It's easy to get angry, and some might even say you're justified for being angry because you were wronged. Carnegie did not take it personally, and that allowed him to keep his cool and think of solutions to negotiate. Carnegie focused on the result and the process. He focuses on persuading for the cost saving, which is the result, but also the effort of persuading itself, which is the process. It's not an either or for him, which is result or process. He focuses on the cost saving and the persuading in everything he does. Carnegie considered this a success, even though the rent is only increased by 50%. Although there was an increase, which to some might still feel a bit of an unfairness because it was a change from the original price that the hotel agreed with Carnegie. The 50% still shows the result of a successful negotiation. It still saved him 250. It's not ideal. Ideally, he wouldn't even face an increment. It allows him to celebrate the little things, especially one of those little things, which perhaps for the rest of us might be a big thing if we implement this process, is to negotiate a successful agreement, even though he was under a high stress situation and rather between a rock and a hard place. There are a lot of interesting articles that explain why we argue. One of them by Fabio Pagliari and Cristiano Castelfranci. I apologize for any mispronunciation. Argumentation is instrumental to some extra dialogical goal. Now, what does the extra dialogical goal mean? It's best for me to explain this showing two examples. The first extra dialogical goal is persuading a buyer to buy item X. But the extra dialogical goal is persuading the buyer to buy item X because buyer believes X is worth buying. This shows some internal conviction that you, the persuader, wants to get the buyer to believe. In Carnegie's example, the dialogical goal would be persuading the hotel manager to lower the rental increment. That is, on paper, what he and what most rational people in his position would do. But the extra dialogical goal is persuading the hotel manager to lower the rental increment because the hotel manager believes it is in the hotel's interest to lower that increment. See what he did there? He got the manager to realize that he was on his side. How is this useful to us? An article in Psychology Today called what Carnegie does as perspective taking. This term means very close to what it means in the ordinary way of speaking. Perspective taking means taking the perspective of another person. Psychology Today talks about many different benefits of doing so. It allows more information being disclosed. For example, while Carnegie was discussing with the manager would have probably revealed that his hands were seemingly tied because this order of increasing the rental cost came from his higher ups. Although we know ultimately that his hands weren't as tight as we thought, this process of getting information was the starting point to achieve that successful negotiation. Secondly, and rather interestingly, perspective taking increases memory retention. I suspect it's because you hear points from the other side and you contrast that with your own side. It ends up creating a pair of opposing arguments that sit together, where one stimulates the neuron that contains the other. For me as a law student, I can say I often easily remember the counter argument by remembering the argument, or remembering the argument by remembering the counter argument. Either way, one of them helps me remember the other. Finally, it facilitates problem solving. As lawyers, that is our job, but as someone in daily living who will inevitably face disagreements. That is my job as well. Problem solving is part of it is to know what the problem is. And you cannot know what the problem is without knowing both sides of the argument. Otherwise, it's like trying to solve a puzzle with only half the puzzle pieces. I dedicate this last section to lawyers because I feel that lawyers are often facing a loss or a disconnect from the values of their profession. A lawyer's natural asset, I labeled this slide, we should be able to see arguments on both sides. In fact, in law school, that's what we are trained with. We might think we already consider arguments on both sides from 9 to 5 and probably much later than that on those peak periods, and which some might say last a whole year. However, we cannot escape dealing with arguments. And sometimes lawyers bring forth that anger that they have from the pent up stress in the workplace to their arguments, but do not bring out that ability to see the arguments of the other side. This is therefore an exhortation to do so from me as a lawyer rather young in my life, in my career, however, rather experienced in facing my fair share of conflicts which I seek to resolve. This brings us to the end of this personal coaching session based on law. Give me your comments, tell me if you like it, tell me if you found it useful, and do drop a like and subscribe. Thanks, and this is Brendan Lau signing out.